Good afternoon. Namaskar from my side. I'm from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are a non-profit research think tank based out of New Delhi, and our main motive, our main goal is to impact sustainable development at scale through data integrated analysis and strategic outreach. Basically, we want to promote more robust evidence-based policy making in the country. And our team is only growing. We have three main pillars or verticals: the transformation pillar, quality of life enablers, and within the transformation pillar, I am part of the low carbon economy, but you can also see that we have people working on power markets. Dhruva is part of that. We have a dedicated team working on industrial sustainability, sustainable livelihoods, on the quality of life, how to promote and have clean air, sustainable water, food systems, so on and so forth. We've been growing very rapidly. We are now over 300 people, and we have a footprint in over 20 states in India. So in the next 15 and 20 minutes, I hope to talk about two major things. The first is what has been Gujarat's energy emissions and macroeconomic story until now. And secondly, we will look into the net zero emission pathways for Gujarat, and hopefully by the end of the presentation, I'll try to convince you that when we talk about net zero, which basically means thinking about, planning about the next 40-50 years, we are not just talking about a transformation of the energy sector, where energy is supplied and where energy is consumed, but net zero is about economic transformation, and this requires long-term thinking. So what has been Gujarat's energy emissions and economic story until now? So in this figure, what you see is the emissions in Gujarat from 2005 until 2020, and the various colors show the emissions, where are these energy sector emissions are coming from. The first thing that you see in the figure on the right is that 45% of total emissions, energy sector emissions in Gujarat, are coming from the industry sector, and 41% are coming from power generation. This includes both public utilities and it could include captive power plants. The main important point is, whenever I'm talking about emissions or generation throughout this presentation, I'm talking about everything which is happening within the geographical boundaries of Gujarat. So if there is power which is procured from other states or sold to other states, that's not accounted for. And I'll come to at the end why this is the case. The second thing that you see from this figure is that between 2009 and 2019, basically you can say almost like the last decade, energy sector emissions have increased around 5%. Industry sector emissions have increased by around 6%, and the fastest growth of emissions has actually happened in the transport sector. So the main takeaway from this slide is industry sector as the largest share of emissions is very important from an emissions perspective in Gujarat, and it's also one of the fastest growing. Now this is the same figure, but now it is showing the emissions by fuel, right? So if you look at the purple part of this figure, that are emissions coming from coal use in the energy sector in Gujarat. And what you see is that the share of emissions from coal use is declining. So it was around 67% in the 2014-15, and right now, or whether in 2020, this is around 55%. Now what you see, the figure on the right, are the same emissions, but now from the two most important sectors, electricity generation and industries. So until 2020, what you see is that the emissions from the power sector are actually declining, and it seems that the emissions already reached a peak in 2015. Whereas in the industry sector, the fuel use is more diversified. Of course, there is coal use, but there is also a lot of gas being used, a lot of diesel being used. So the main takeaway from this slide is that emissions are mainly coming from coal that is used, particularly coal that is used in power plants. Now this figure is showing you how we are diving slightly more into the power sector, details of the power sector, is how the power generation mix in Gujarat in the last 10 to 12 years. The first thing that you notice here is that there has been an increase in power generation in the last decade, growing at around 3%. However, again, what you also saw in the emission story is that the share of coal is actually being decreased. It was around 83% in 2013-14 and it's now around 55%. And coal-based generation already has peaked in 2015-15. So it seems, to the most part, if we see now, that emissions from the power sector in Gujarat, as I say, accounting only within the geographic boundaries, seems to have already peaked, which I think is a major milestone. That's kind of one milestone when we look at energy transition. We see peaking years and decline years, and Gujarat seems to have already achieved that. The third thing we see is that in 23-24, the share of renewable energy has already reached around 32%. Now, as I mentioned before, this is not power procurement, but this is power generation taking place within the boundaries of Gujarat. Now, looking at again a more macroeconomic aspect, this figure I've taken from the Gujarat Energy Efficiency Plan. This shows, the figure in yellow, in orange is showing you how the total energy consumption in Gujarat has increased. And of course, this will increase because the economy is growing very strongly. And so over the last 5 years, from 14-15 to 19-20, it has increased. However, the energy intensity, here it is defined as the total final energy consumption divided by the GDP. So in those terms, the energy intensity has actually decreased. Now, there are three main reasons why energy intensity can decrease in an economy. The first reason is there is increasing energy use of end use. For example, the PAT scheme is, especially among industrial efficiency, is one, but they can, again, all the industrial efficiency measures that have happened in the building sector and residential sector all are contributing to this. The second is they can be changed in the structure of the economy. So from a more manufacturing-based economy to a more service-based economy, because a service-based economy requires less energy, or it can be the change of manufacturing. So for example, Gujarat might be changing from a more iron and steel or oil and gas type of economy to a less energy-intensive economy like textiles. These are three main reasons, but the most probable among them is probably the first point, which is that energy efficiency measures are actually leading to a decrease in energy intensity in Gujarat. Now, this figure is showing you how the GVA, the gross value added of the different sectors in Gujarat has changed over time, has changed over the last decade. The main point, the takeaway from this is that over the last 10 years, there has been a very concerted policy push. There has been a very strong industrial policy which has actually led us here, where you see that the share of manufacturing, which was around 28% in 11-12, has increased to 37%. Now, as a summary slide from what I just mentioned, is that power and industry has contributed almost 86% of the total energy emissions in Gujarat, and industry sector is also the one which is the fastest growing. The overall energy emissions have increased. However, the emissions from the power sector are already on a decreasing trend, mainly because the share of coal in the electricity mix is decreasing. Thirdly, despite an increase in total energy consumption, we have seen that primarily energy efficiency measures have led us to a decrease in energy intensity. And lastly, Gujarat has become an industry-heavy state because of dedicated industrial policy, freight policies, which have led us to this juncture. Now, the second part of my presentation is around Gujarat's long-term energy modeling, around Gujarat's net zero strategies. So, I think before I start, what I want to mention is that whenever we are talking about net zero and all the results that I will even show you from the model, they are not predictions in the future. We are not saying that in the next 20-30 years this will happen. But in fact, you should see it the other way around, saying that if we have to reach, if collectively as a society we decide we want to reach net zero by 2050 or by 2070, and we have certain expectations or assumptions that we have about the future of energy efficiency technology and the cost of technologies, then these are the things that we have to do. My professor used to give me this example that before we knew the contours of the world, before we had a map of the world, we all were, there were people who were sailing in a ship trying to look for new land, right? So whenever you have this vast ocean and you don't know where land is, every bit of information, there are people who are who discovered islands. There were people who were discovered, oh well, the ocean is this much deep in water. So you should see this exercise as saying, well, we are charting into a huge ocean, but at the same time, we do need, in this phase of uncertainty, we still need to make decisions, right? And this is how this modeling exercise should be seen. So we have three main scenarios that you will see. The first is a BAU or the reference scenario. And then we have two net zero scenarios. One in which Gujarat becomes net zero in 2050, and another in which Gujarat becomes net zero in 2070. The main difference between these two scenarios is that in the first scenario, in the reference scenario, we are saying there is no limit on coal power generation, and there are energy efficiency improvements that happen in industry which are moderate in nature. These improvements we take from the Gujarat Energy Efficiency Plan. And the second scenario is one in which there are no new coal plants being built beyond 2030. So basically all the under construction and planned coal power plants are built, but none of them are built. There are no new plants after 2030, and the industry efficiency improvements are much higher in the industry sector. So there's more push towards industrial efficiency improvements. Through this exercise, we also consider a lot of policy documents, the Gujarat RE policy, solar policy, wind policy, advocacy reports. So all of these reports were considered whenever we are designing these policies. So at least the reference scenario was in line with the expectations, the current expectations in the policy sphere. So like all modeling studies, there are a lot of assumptions that are used, and it's important to list down what are the key assumptions. The major assumptions are on population, how it will grow, how the urbanization will happen, the growth rates, because we know that the Viksit Gujarat document clearly says that the vision for Gujarat is become a $500 billion economy by 26-27 and a $3.5 trillion economy by 2047. They also mentioned that the role of manufacturing in GVA will also change. So we try to align these major assumptions to the Viksit Gujarat document. Then the capital cost of technology is again a very important assumption, and at least the electricity generation cost, these were vetted by GETRI. We had a discussion with them that how these costs will evolve, change in the future. For example, the solar cost, we know that they will probably decline at a much higher trend than the wind cost, so wind offshore. Everything, all this whole process was followed with GETRI. And the efficiency improvements, apart from the one for industrial efficiency, we take from literature. So how these efficiency improvements have happened in the past in, let's say, the building sector through appliances or in the transport sector. These we take from literature. So the main modeling tool that we use for this analysis is a model called GCAM, the Global Change Analysis Model, CEEW, because this was a large part of the further development happened within our institute. So it's actually a global model, with India is divided into 29 states. It tries to capture India-specific expectation and assumptions. And as you see in this kind of a very complicated figure right here, but just for the main point I want to share is that there is an energy demand side, which is all the different sectors which are demanding electricity. There is a supply side which is trying to supply that electricity, and everything is connected by prices. So if there is demand in one sector increases, the prices accordingly change, which affects demand in other sides. So all these interactions are captured in this model, and ultimately our supply and demand leads to emissions, right? And this is what we actually want to reduce in the model. So this model has already been used for the states of Maharashtra. We have used this model to prepare the Maharashtra SAP-CC. For Bihar, we prepared the climate resilient and low carbon development pathway. For Tamil Nadu, net zero work has already been done. Some work on Rajasthan we're doing, and besides Gujarat, we are also working on the state of Uttarakhand. Now I come to the results of our analysis. So the first thing that we see is that if we are on trajectory as planned, then the emissions in Gujarat will keep on increasing, right? So without dedicated policy, by 2070, so in the next 50 years, emissions will increase almost 5 times. The second thing that you see from this figure is that the largest share of emissions, right now I said, this is around 45%, it grows, the emissions grow, and the major share of emissions come from the industry sector, around 60%. Now, if we look at the net zero scenarios, so the middle one is a scenario in which Gujarat goes net zero. Again, when I talk about net zero, I'm specifically talking about emissions from the energy sector and the IPP and the industrial process sector. So, in the net zero 50, emissions decrease have to decrease much faster. In the net zero net zero 70, we have slightly more time. But in both scenarios, which is perhaps slightly harder to see, is that the power sector is the one which decarbonizes first. Because if you look at the marginal abatement cost, the cheapest option are actually there in the power sector. So in the net zero 50, the power sector gets decarbonized by 2035, and in the net zero 70, the power sector is completely decarbonized, free of electricity, free of fossil electricity by 2050. Now, where are these emissions coming from? Of course, these emissions are coming from energy which is being used in different sectors. So, if you look at the total energy consumption, how is that changing? Again, we see a similar picture that first is that the energy demand increasing almost 8 times between 2020 and 2070. And I want to emphasize that why this is increasing by this extent is because the GDP assumptions particularly that we are taking are very strong. So the growth assumptions on how Gujarat will evolve according to the Viksit Gujarat document especially are very high, which is driving a lot of future increase in energy. If we look at what is happening now in the 2050 and 2070 scenarios, energy demand is still increasing, but energy demand is lower, and that's mainly happening is because of electrification. So electrification in the industry sector, in the transport sector, in the building sector is increasing, is more energy efficient, of course, and that's why the total energy consumption is lower, but it is still increasing by a very significant magnitude. Now, if we look, now we are moving from the sectors which are consuming energy to what are the fuels being used, right? So, if you look at the reference scenario, particularly in 2030, we see that a lot of the energy that's being consumed is being consumed from refined liquids, basically, like your oil, gas, so on. And the amount of electricity that's being consumed in total energy is only around 18%. Now, even in 2070, there is, of course, 16%. So, even by 2070, there is a lot of electrification happening, and this, as I will show you later on, is mainly happening in the transport sector, because there are more EVs that are coming in. But still, this is not much. However, if you move from a 2050 to a 2070 scenario, you see there is massive electrification. So in 2070, for example, almost 90% of all the energy that we are consuming in Gujarat is all electrified, right? So your whole industry, a lot of your industry is electrified. There are a few industries which are actually using hydrogen, and here we do have the hydrogen costs that we also took. They were also taken from GETRI. There is a ambition also in India. There is a big push to green hydrogen, and we want to have a very low cost of hydrogen. But this figure is essentially showing you there will be hydrogen, but it will be limited to certain sectors. For the most part, all the end use will be electrified. Again, in the net zero 50 case, all the big changes that need to happen in 2070, they are just happening way faster because your ambition is way strong. Again, this is not a forecast. This is just telling you, well, if this is your aim, what does it imply for you, and trying to really, bring it into a clear visualization of what you need to do. Now, of course, all these electrification that is happening in end use, right? It is really increasing a lot of electricity generation that needs to happen. So, in a reference scenario, your consumption, your electricity consumption is only increasing by around 12 times from 125 billion units in 2020 to around 1250 billion units in 2070. However, in 2070, because Gujarat has such a big industry sector, and all of this industry sector needs to be electrified, the amount of electricity generation to happen is a lot. It's almost increases by 26 times in 2070, and again in 2050, all those big transformations that need to happen, they're just happening way faster. Now moving on from the demand side, we now move to the very critical supply side. So where is all this power coming from? That's the main question secondly. So with current technology trend, already in the reference scenario, we are seeing that a lot of the future electricity power generation in Gujarat, that's going to come from solar and wind, right? That you see from this graph. Again, in net zero 50 and 70, this needs to be ramped up much more, right? So there is much more electricity, and a lot of it is coming from solar and wind. However, even that alone is not enough for Gujarat. So Gujarat becomes suddenly very power hungry. So even in 2070, Gujarat becomes a net importer of electricity. So this is what our analysis is hinting at. So what does this eventually mean? So what do these long-term plans eventually mean for us in the near term, right? I think that's a big question. The first thing it means is that this figure is basically showing you what is the capacity addition that needs to take place, the average capacity addition that needs to take place in Gujarat for three main categories: solar, wind and coal. These will be the three dominant technologies. The first thing that you see is that at least in the long term, the amount of capacity addition that needs to take place is almost double. So from 12 gigawatt per year, which we project in the reference scenario, it increases to 25 to 35 gigawatt per year. If we look at the near term changes are smaller. So in the near term, in the next 20 years, around 10 or 11 gigawatt of solar are added. However, they need to increase much more if we are to pursue a net zero path. The same goes for wind. So both solar and wind addition needs to be much more faster if we are looking at a net zero world. Now these are the cumulative investments that happen in the power sector. So in the business as usual, a reference scenario, in the next 50 years, around 52 lakh crore rupees are spent building the power infrastructure. In the net zero 71, it increases 37% more. I mean, this is a fact that we all know, that once we in a net zero world, we have of course the benefits that accrue to it, but we also have to spend substantially more. So these are around 71 lakh crore, and in a 2050 world, this is even higher because of all the reasons that I've mentioned before. Now these investment costs are only on the supply side. So all the demand side investments are something that I've not considered here. Now another very critical, perhaps slightly controversial point might also be, because you have to reach net zero, there is also a risk of stranded capacity, especially of those plants which are, we know that Gujarat has a certain amount of coal capacity, there is some capacity under construction, and then there is also capacity which is planned. So assuming all of that and then comparing the natural lifetime of power plants, in a net zero 2070 world, building all this capacity would mean that around 1 gigawatt per year of capacity will be stranded. And that's basically happening now because you're building all this coal, but in the future, coal will be, not only solar systems will become much more cheaper, but because you have put a price on the pollution, in this case coal becomes way more expensive. So this is basically pointing out the fact that whenever you are building something now, you shouldn't think about its profitability right now, but you should also think about what will happen in the next 10 years. And this is especially relevant for infrastructure which has long lifetime. Maybe a car, something for 10 years, it doesn't really matter. For some things that are going to exist for the next 40 years, these decisions become very critical. In terms of, again, energy intensity, so this figure is similar to the one that I showed before, which is basically about energy intensity. So both electrification that's happening in the system and energy efficiency measures that are actually leading to a reduction in energy intensity. and this intensity is much more higher. So Gujarat can also form, if it wants to reach net zero, to form clear energy intensity targets that can also be formulated. Now my last slide is basically summarizing all of what we have heard before. The first slide is that, the first point is that if for a net zero Gujarat, it needs to critically focus on industry decarbonization. Of course, this is assuming that the basic structure of Gujarat industry doesn't change. However, so if the current industrial sector doesn't change, then we have seen that there are significant challenges in terms of end-use electrification. The challenges in terms of increasing the electricity consumption. So the power supply challenges are quite clear. We saw how much ramp up of electricity in solar and wind needs to happen. However, there are other ways to also decarbonize, right? So there are other structural options to decarbonize. The first is reduce the share of high energy intensive industry. So Gujarat decides that because it wants to grow at at this pace that has been mentioned. At the same time, it wants to reach net zero or have a sustainable economy. Then it starts to move away from very heavy industries, for example, iron and steel, oil refineries, and starts moving towards those type of industries which require less electricity and less energy intensive. For example, semiconductors. For example, in electronics, which deliver the same kind of GDP output but are less energy intensive. Or the other way is to reduce the share of manufacturing GVA. So think about a world in which the last 10 years, what Gujarat has done for industrial policy, the next 32 years, it very strongly moves towards a service-based economy. So there are already examples that exist for this. Karnataka and Telangana are good examples of how they have been a concerted policy push in the services side, in the IT side, and that's why their economies are less energy efficient. We also saw that the pace of transformation in 2015, in the 2015 net zero world, is higher and faster. So in the near-term strategies for Gujarat, what can they be? The first, what is very critical that I've mentioned before, is the decarbonizing the power sector, right? So there are already some power plants under construction, but for net zero, it's very critical that there are no new additional fossil power plants being built, and that the renewable energy targets are also made higher. The second is that Gujarat needs to attract industries related to renewable energy, because there will be such a big push towards solar and wind. It makes a lot of economic sense to have the whole life cycle of solar, the whole manufacturing life cycle happening in Gujarat. The third is to really consider the risk of new investments in high intensive industries. This is something that I've already mentioned before. And the role of energy efficiency, particularly electrification, comes out very clearly from this presentation. Energy efficiency and fuel switching improvements in large industry. We know that the government is planning a carbon credit trading scheme, which will be successor of the PAT scheme. And through this, it aims to reduce the emissions, especially in the large industries. The MSME sector energy efficiency improvements, they are also critically important. That's something that can be pushed on, at least in the near term. And secondly, the electrification of the transport sector. In a lot of places, especially two-wheelers and three-wheeler electrification has happened organically. So the government needs to continue push two-wheelers and three-wheeler segment, and then think also about the whole infrastructure becomes very important for electrification of the transport. So I leave you with a few open questions and some future work that we want to do for this work. We first want to deep dive into potential industrial sectors to look at what is happening individually in these sectors, which have more potential, which have less potential. Then there are open questions. Should Gujarat increasingly focus on a service-led economy? How does that change the emissions profile? What are the technical challenges related to the high share of renewable energy in the power grid? Can they be overcome to really ramp up solar and wind that we need for net zero? And secondly, the role of pumped hydro and battery storage is also something that we want to explore more. Now I know that this presentation, like for me, it's a great opportunity because generally whenever I'm talking about net zero and decarbonization, my audience is completely different because this type of studies, they try to give you a macroeconomic, a bird's eye view of the big changes that are required, but often the very technical challenges that actually exist within, let's say, one sector, they don't come up to us. And I think this is a great audience for me to learn, the particular, let's say, power sector challenges here. So I'm happy to take also any additional questions, but yeah, this is from my side. Thank you. So the floor is open for questions. Please be candid. You can ask, and we can discuss. Yes.
So you just pointed out that Gujarat should concentrate on moving away from manufacturing of heavy industry and service led.
Yeah.
Somehow I would I think we need to ponder about it because the life still has to happen. If there is no manufacturing, there is no service industry. So I think it has to be more. It cannot be so myopic that you have to take away industry. You take away those heavy industries, they have to go somewhere. Because you still need things to live. So
right.
I think we need to think about those points and see how better we can manage that situation rather than everybody becoming service-led or moving away from heavy industries.
Yeah, I think everything needs to be discussed here. The main part of this discussion is to ask what the right questions to ask. It's about to have a structured discussion. There are no rights or wrongs as per this presentation. It's just asking you if that's a solution, and I think so. And it doesn't have to completely move to a service-based economy. That anyway, this level of transition is anyway impossible. But it's asking where should the future policy push be? The manufacturer is not going to disappear anyway. That's almost impossible to say. You can't remove the legacy that has been established. Yeah.
Hello. My first question is that we already have world's largest renewable park in Khavda. So that capacity has been factored in the figures which we are representing.
Yes.
And second is we have already built HVDCs also to cater that technical related to grid stability. The area which needs to be focused is offshore wind farms because we have a coastal belt and that has a potential for offshore, but India has been lagging behind in that part. Whereas global utilities like Ørsted and Vattenfall, they have been building great offshore wind farms, and even in US they are. So how India is planning to battle and optimize the ocean belts?
Right. I think that's the question of wind especially is very, very important, and we know that at least there are some initial studies on the potential for wind which have been done for Tamil Nadu, for Gujarat, and I think there is also recent policy to provide VGF, right, for wind offshore. The question ultimately comes upon costs, right? So as per discussion with GETRI, costs are very high right now. They are expected to decrease. In fact, we also here assume a very significant reduction in wind cost. But even besides that, the model is essentially trying to optimize on costs, and it is also trying to at least think about, okay, if there are certain technologies which are more challenging, they will come slowly. For example, we know even for electric vehicles, sometimes the cost component is less of a problem than the non-economic barriers. So considering all of this, there is wind coming up in the system. There is offshore wind, which I don't show the detail, but still solar is the one which will be the major one. That's at least we think. So the question is, so if I understand your question, sir, it's about whether we should consider other carbon removal sequestration technologies.
Exactly, the biogas development, which is the buzzword nowadays.
Yeah. So in the model, we do assume that a certain amount of emissions, and that's why if you remember the figures, they don't go exactly to zero. There is some amount of emissions that are left, and that's because these are happening on the sequestration side. So that basically a lot of trees which is taking up But in India, we are also limited by amount of sequestration that can happen. Because see, you have old forest. The thing with old forest is that they have already matured. So the amount of CO2 that they are taking every year is very small. Then for all the new forest that needs to happen, you need land. So basically you are also limited by some amount to how much sequestration can we do. We have assumed something here. It is limited. What we have not assumed are certain very radical, well I shouldn't say radical, but they have not been seen on a more big scale, like carbon dioxide removal directly from air. So these type of technologies is something we have not considered. But I mean, again, it's a choice. So at the end of the time, and you will realize probably that a lot of the emissions that are left, let's say as you move towards net zero, they are very, very expensive to have, right? And then the question is, what kind of other alternatives you have? Do you have carbon dioxide removal technologies? I mean, a big question probably in a lot of your minds is also about CCS, like carbon capture and storage. So here again, we assume a only limited amount of carbon capture and storage that is happening in the cement sector. For a lot of other sectors, not a lot of carbon capture is available. But again, this is a developing field. Results that you show now, after 5-10 years, they look very different because everything is developing so fast. Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. See, there can be a lot of solutions that exist in very particular niche industries. But the point of this analysis, to some extent, is to show what are the changes that are needed, which are large, and what are the changes which are small. You're very correct, that in certain industries, bioethanol or things like this, or making more products directly from biomass, that might be possible. But here in our analysis, we say that they will happen. So there is some amount of liquids that are there, like biomass-based liquids in the model, but their share is very small. So this is what
That is part of cumulative effort.
Sorry?
That is part of cumulative effort.
Cumulative.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's what I want to say. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. So we have questions. We have done. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I will happy to. We are out of time, so we'll be happy to take more questions bilaterally or whenever we have time over snacks and